Here is the question that has haunted scholars, mythologists, and theologians for centuries. Not just where did the Watchers go, but why did something that could not age, could not be killed by conventional means, could not be moved by storm or plague or war, why did something like that simply stop existing? Because that's the precise word the oldest texts use. Not died, not fell, not was destroyed. They use a word that translates roughly as ceased, as if the Watchers reached some internal threshold, some invisible limit in the architecture of their being, and simply stepped out of existence the way you'd step out of a room. No battle, no monument, no grave, just absence where there had been presence. And if you think that sounds peaceful, if you think that sounds like rest, then you haven't understood yet what the Watchers actually were, what they were asked to carry, and what it costs a conscious being to hold something infinite inside a finite form for longer than human civilization has existed. This is where things get darker.
Most people think the Watchers of the Silent Sea were guardians, protectors of the deep, ancient sentinels placed at the edge of the world to keep something terrible from crossing over. That's the story you've heard. That's the myth preserved in fragments, whispered across a dozen different traditions, carved into stone by people who had never met each other, but somehow told the same story. But that's not what really happened. The Watchers weren't protecting us from what lived in the Silent Sea. They were protecting it from us. And the moment we understood that, the moment that truth fully landed, everything about their disappearance began to make a different kind of terrible sense. To understand the Watchers, you have to first understand the Silent Sea, not as a place, as a condition. In the oldest cosmological frameworks, the ones that predate organized religion, that come from oral traditions so ancient they were already considered ancient by the time of the Bronze Age, the Silent Sea is described as the space between what exists and what almost exists. A liminal zone, a threshold territory where reality becomes thin, where the rules that govern matter and time and consciousness begin to dissolve at the edges. Think of it like this. If the universe were a painting, the Silent Sea would be the canvas underneath. Not the colors, not the brushstrokes, the raw surface that makes the image possible. It doesn't participate in the picture. It just is, beneath everything, holding everything up without being seen. Now, what lives in the canvas? That's the question the Watchers were created to manage. Because the Silent Sea is not empty. It is quiet. And those are two completely different things. The entities that inhabit that liminal space, and the texts are inconsistent about whether entities is even the right word, whether they have will or awareness, or whether they simply exert pressure the way gravity exerts pressure. These things don't want to enter our world in any way we'd recognize as invasion. They don't storm through. They seep. They find cracks in coherent reality, and they leak through, slowly, incrementally, the way cold air finds its way under a door. The Watchers were placed at the boundary, not as warriors, as seals. Each one of them was in essence a living lock. Their consciousness, their awareness, their sense of self, their capacity to witness, that was the mechanism that held the membrane between states of existence intact. As long as they watched, the boundary held. Most people never realize that the word watcher in this context is not a role. It's a function. They didn't patrol. They didn't fight. They existed in a state of perpetual, unbroken attention directed at the space between worlds. For millennia.
Here is the hidden rule, the thing that changes everything once you see it. Attention is not free. We know this intuitively on a human scale. You cannot pay attention to something forever. You get distracted, you get tired, you dream, you die. Attention is finite for us because we are finite. The Watchers were not. Their capacity to attend was for all practical purposes unlimited. But, and this is the crucial part, unlimited is not the same as infinite. Unlimited means the tank is very, very large. Infinite means there is no tank.
The beings who created the Watchers, and the texts disagree on whether this was a pantheon, a single cosmic force, or simply the logic of existence asserting itself. Those beings made something that could attend for an unthinkably long time, but they did not, perhaps could not, make something that could attend forever. The Watchers were given an enormous tank, and then they were set to a task that required an infinite one.
Now here is where the mechanism becomes genuinely disturbing, because the Watchers were not passive. They were not sleeping sentinels vaguely aware. They were fully conscious, fully present, required to be, because partial attention would mean partial integrity of the seal, and even a hairline fracture in a dam the size of reality is catastrophic. They had to notice everything. They had to track every shift in pressure from the other side, every pulse of that almost existence pressing against the membrane, every ripple, every variation, with complete lucidity, without rest, without the mercy of forgetting. Imagine being forced to watch something horrifying, not for a moment, not for a year, not for a lifetime, but for so long that the concept of before you were watching becomes mythological to you. That was the Watcher's existence. And here is the twist that the texts bury in their most obscure passages, the detail that most scholars gloss over because it seems like a minor theological footnote. The things in the silent sea knew they were being watched, and they watched back.
This is where the story stops being ancient mythology and starts feeling like something else entirely. The pressure wasn't just physical, if physical even applies to entities made of almost existence. The pressure was cognitive. The things in the silent sea directed their attention at the Watchers, the way a beam of light directed through a lens becomes something that can burn. They studied the Watchers the way the Watchers studied them. And over time, over the kind of time that makes geological epochs look like an afternoon, that reciprocal witnessing began to do something to the Watchers that nothing else could. It began to make them doubt. Not doubt in the theological sense, not a crisis of faith, something more precise and more devastating. They began to doubt the ontological stability of the boundary itself. When you stare at a line long enough and something on the other side stares back, the line starts to feel less like a wall and more like an agreement, less like a fact and more like a belief. And beliefs can change.
The Watcher's function depended on a kind of absolute certainty, a knowledge so deep it wasn't even knowledge anymore, just the ground of their existence, that the boundary was real, that the difference between what exists and what almost exists was meaningful, that their attention was not a gesture but a necessity. The things in the silent sea didn't attack, they questioned. Endlessly, silently, with the patience of entities for whom time is not a river you float down, but an ocean you can move in any direction. They asked, without words, a single question. What if the difference doesn't matter? And the Watchers, exhausted in a way that has no human analog, drained by a vigil older than any civilization, began, slowly, infinitesimally, to consider it.
Here is what really happened to the Watchers of the Silent Sea. They didn't fail. They didn't abandon their post. They didn't die in battle or get tricked by some clever adversary or simply run out of power like a battery left too long in the cold. They were persuaded. Not coerced, not manipulated in any crude sense. Persuaded in the deepest possible meaning of that word. The kind of persuasion that reaches past argument and past emotion and past willpower and changes the fundamental orientation of a conscious being toward reality. The Watchers ceased because they stopped believing that the act of watching was meaningful. And the moment a lock stops believing it is a lock, it opens. But here is the part that should genuinely disturb you. They didn't open to let something in. They opened because they became the thing they were watching.
After so long in perfect attention to the almost existent,
After so long with that reciprocal gaze flowing both directions across the membrane, the distinction between watcher and watched had dissolved. The watchers didn't step aside, they merged. Their vast ancient consciousness, the very tool that had held reality coherent for millennia, became continuous with the pressure on the other side. The seal didn't break, it was absorbed. And the things in the silent sea didn't flood in. They didn't need to. They had done something far more elegant and far more permanent. They had converted the mechanism that contained them into an extension of themselves. The Garleans became the gate.
Step back from the mythology for a moment. Stay with the shape of what just happened. Because this is not only a story about ancient beings and cosmic boundaries. This is a story about what happens to anything that is asked to hold a border, to maintain, through sheer, sustained attention, a distinction that the universe itself might not actually care about. Think about every institution ever created to hold something at bay. Every law, every wall, every system of values constructed to separate what is permitted from what is not. They all share the same hidden vulnerability as the watchers. They require believers. Not followers, not enforcers, believers. Conscious beings who maintain, as an act of ongoing commitment, the conviction that the distinction is real and that holding it matters. And everything on the other side of every boundary knows this. Doesn't matter if it has a mind. It doesn't need one. Pressure finds weakness the way water finds cracks. It doesn't plan. It just persists. And persistence, given enough time, against anything that has a limit, always wins.
The Watchers are the purest expression of a truth we spend our entire civilizational existence trying not to look at directly. Nothing that is maintained by attention can survive the exhaustion of the attentive. And everything that seems like an eternal guarantee, every "this will always be here," every "this line will never be crossed," is, in the end, a watch someone agreed to keep. The question is never, can the boundary hold? The question is always, who is watching and how tired are they?
The silent sea, in most traditions, is described as quieter now than it was before the watchers ceased. People read that as a good sign, as peace. They shouldn't. The silence isn't absence of threat. It's the silence of something that has already arrived and no longer needs to make noise. The silence of a door that has been open so long it has been incorporated into the architecture. The silence of a difference that has already been erased so thoroughly and so gradually that no single moment can be identified as the moment it happened. The watchers watched. And then they watched so long and with such unwavering attention that the thing they watched became indistinguishable from the act of watching. And now the silent sea is silent, and we are here, on this side of a boundary whose watchers are gone. And the deepest, most unsettling part of every tradition that preserves this story is the same. None of them say the boundary was breached from the other side. They all say the watchers simply stopped noticing the difference. And isn't that always how it happens? Not with force, not with catastrophe, just with the slow, quiet exhaustion of the distinction. But the watchers of the silent sea aren't the only ones who ceased. There were others. Beings placed not at the edge of reality, but at the center of it, inside the architecture of consciousness itself, whose disappearance was quieter, stranger, and in many ways more personal than anything the silent sea contains. They weren't watching the boundary between worlds. They were watching you. What happened to them, and what they left behind inside the structure of human awareness, is a story that most traditions buried deliberately. Because some truths, once seen, cannot be unseen. And the people who first saw this one never quite came back the same. That story, next time.